Welcome back, everyone. So the next session is something that's really important to everyone here at FSRA and I'm sure for the regulated sectors. One of our key priorities is to help Ontario become a leader in financial innovation in Canada and around the world. To ensure that consumers across the province have access to the latest advancements in financial services while protecting the public interest, we are going to talk to you about what we are doing and explore the fintech landscape in Ontario. I am pleased to introduce Marlena Labinek, the Director of Innovation at FSRA. She will be joined by Lail El Hadi, the Executive Director of Fintech Cadence, and Elvis Wong, the Director of Financial Health at Fintech Cadence. Over to you, Marlena.
Thank you, Glenn. And I'll just wait for my colleagues, for my panel to show up. Good morning, everyone. And thank you again, Glenn, for such a warm introduction. As Mark mentioned at the start of this morning's conversation, the Innovation Office has just officially released FSRA's Innovation Framework. And to really quickly remind you all, the objective of the framework is to set clear expectation and guiding principles to help market players bring innovative products in a sustainable, responsible, and accessible way. The framework speaks to some of the tools and processes we have built to put in place to make this easier and to make it easier for market players to propose new ideas, products and services, while of course we continue to maintain consumer confidence in our financial services system in Ontario. We have also just opened our doors to our test and learn environment. We are launching this as a pilot with scope that is suitable for a pilot, but the goal is to expand through proactive engagement with sectors and startup growth engines like Fintech Cadence. Fintech Cadence is Canada's fintech hub, founded in Montreal. Their mission is to foster innovation in the fintech sector and create world-class Canadian fintechs. They collaborate with many great talents, startups, universities, researchers, VCs, incubators, accelerators, and financial institutions to work and innovate together. Talking about collaboration, guys. Elvis and Lael, thank you so much for joining me today. I invited you this morning to discuss how you believe FSRA and the Innovation Office can support startups trying to create value and deliver responsible innovation for consumers in Ontario. I would love to get your thoughts on how you think the innovation framework can support fintechs and insurtechs and potential challenges that we might be faced with. And lastly, some of the key trends that you're seeing these fintechs and insurtechs trying to address and where you see they're trying to drive benefit for our Ontario consumers. So why don't we just dive right in? You guys have provided a lot of great support and insightful feedback throughout our consultation. As you are quite familiar with the innovation framework, often we hear that regulation is seen as a threat to innovation. What do you think of FSRA as a multi-sector financial services regulator undertaking an innovation facilitation role? What are your thoughts?
Hi, Marlena. Thank you very much for having Elvis and I here today. And it's been really wonderful listening to all of the panels prior to us as well. So to the best of our ability, we'll try and give our experiences and our opinions here where valuable. I think first and foremost, it's very important to note that a regulator plays a very tremendous role in the development of fintech in general. And I think if we understand that and we go into the context of the conversation is that you can't have fintech in Canada without having regulators. And then you take the next lens and look at, so is it key, as you're asking, Marlena, for FSRA to have an innovation framework? Absolutely, right. It needs to have, I think regulators need to have and understand that whether we want to or not, and I'm assuming everyone here listening today wants to have innovation happen, then it's really key to kind of give a playbook and a positioning of where FSRA stands on it. And what do I mean by that? I mean that it's really key for one, internally FSRA to understand, why is this important to us? Why do we want innovation to happen? And I think we've already heard quite a few people earlier on today address that particular point. And then internally understand, if we agree that innovation needs to happen and we want to support it, then what is FSRA's role internally? And I think that's what the framework serves really wonderfully to do. But then, and more additionally, so I think what's really key is that everyone else participating in this ecosystem, startups, financial institutions, incumbents, et cetera, understand then what is that positioning and what role can regulation play to not only support innovation, but to actually encourage it. And I think that's what we're seeing really wonderfully happen with the framework itself.
Thank you, Leah.
And I
Elvis,
want
any
to,
thoughts from you?
yes, I want to add on to that. In the previous panel, it was talked a little bit about how not all innovation is beneficial. And what we'll say here at FinTech Cadence is that we believe that regulation is necessary for FinTech innovation in Canada because we want the good players to survive and the good players to thrive. And then we do know that there's other startups that might not be in the best interest of Canadians. And we want the regulators to be able to both encourage good innovation to thrive and the bad players to potentially be monitored, right? So I think that any startup here in Canada, I think there's a bit of a discussion around how regulation kind of can hurt innovation, but we truly don't believe that's the case. And I think what startups want isn't what they want isn't no regulation. What they want is clear regulation and guidelines so that they know how to operate and what they can do. And more importantly, we've talked a lot about principles-based regulation. So they want to feel like they're being encouraged by the sector as well, right? So it's not that they have to follow these rules and these checklists, but that their mandate and that the regulators are forward thinking in what they're doing.
Thank you. I think you both touched on a very good point, the importance of transparency and clarity, as well as ensuring that, of course, we continue to support and encourage responsible innovation. So, further to move on our innovation framework, do you believe it's sufficient and effective in actually helping us achieve our ambition statement in making Ontario a best-in-class market for financial services innovation? Anything that you would want to take away or mention around that?
Yeah, so we reviewed the framework in detail, and we think it's very comprehensive. So we really appreciate the approach that's being taken, where it's both, I believe you mentioned, is proactive internally. So really, as FSRA, thinking about what are some of the things that we can see in the credit union sector, in the mortgage sector, in the insurance sector, seeing some of these changes that are happening elsewhere globally, and then being proactive in thinking of how we can adopt the regulation so that makes sense for Ontario. But at the same time, also making sure that you're engaging with us, like FinTech Cadence, and external stakeholders for that outside-in approach as well. So we think it's comprehensive from that standpoint, and then also from the element of really like being mindful of both the financial institutions that are in the room today and what they're trying to do, but also what fintechs are trying to do, and trying to take in both perspectives. So we like the comprehensive element. I think the framework is sufficient. The challenge is actually getting it to be actioned upon and really actually starting doing the work.
Yeah, and if I can just jump in here on that last note, Elvis, that's exactly it, right? So a lot of work, and we know, Marlene, a lot of work went into this framework. And I think the ability to leverage it now and be transparent to all the stakeholders in a manner in which they understand what it means. You know, I think something we always see with fintechs is they hesitate to engage with regulators because they find it very complicated. These are not individuals who know how to navigate compliance. They don't necessarily know how to navigate or understand what role regulations might even play. And so we're really starting at talking to entrepreneurs in a level of this is what a regulator's role is. And on top of that, this is how the innovation framework that we've developed, how it's going to help you thrive and what exactly it means for you. I think sometimes fintechs will not only not understand regulation, but think it comes with a big price tag with it as well. And I think once they start getting that anxiety of, okay, well, regulation means compliance. Does it mean I have to hire lawyers? Does it mean I need to pay for somebody to manage this process for me? And I think once entrepreneurs see that or have that misconception, they really take a step back and say, okay, well, that's a problem I'm going to try and deal with when it really arises. Whereas with this innovation framework, if it's implemented the way it's been designed to, if it's really transparent, like Elvis mentioned from the very beginning, and simplified, I think fintechs would be more willing to engage in the conversations, as will other stakeholders as well.
Right. And we've noticed that happen more organically with the establishment of our office. The outside-in approach that you mentioned that's reflected in our framework is key for us to ensure that there's an understanding and opportunity for collaboration and an open door policy. Through hubs like yourself and others, we have been engaging and building that relationship with fintechs and insurtechs to better understand some of the innovations that they're trying to address and problems to solve for. But of course, where does the regulatory friction happen and how then we could best support it? And our tools and processes and elements of the framework were built upon that. So thank you very much for sharing, because I think we also think that is key. So we talked about... Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to add, I think what you said there is really key. Being top of mind is what's really going to help the success of this framework and what's really going to help innovation in Ontario in general, right? I think with the announcements and the publicity around it, that's wonderful. I think startups will hopefully engage with you, like you're saying, consistently, and you guys are being proactive by working with organizations similar to us. I think it needs to happen consistently, whether it's a monthly reminder, FSRA exists. This is why you should be engaging with us. This is how you can engage with us. And it's consistently being placed as top of mind. I think that would also ensure the success of the implementation of the framework.
Okay, great. I think that's, so I think we've somewhat addressed some of the challenges, or not even challenges, but some of the considerations that we have to keep in mind as we now move to the implementation stage. A consistency, transparency, open communication, and anything else that you would advise us to focus on, or maybe take away to ensure that fintechs and startups also feel supported?
Yeah, I can jump in first, Alice, if you don't mind, and then please feel free to add on anything. I think you also, and again, not to be too repetitive here, Marlena, but you also touched on something that's really key, and that's the friction point. So what is the regulatory friction point that some of these startups are facing is also really important. I think, we've talked about quite a few startups having challenges in navigating this, but it's, again, lack of understanding perhaps from their side, and in all honesty, a lack of understanding perhaps from regulators of what is that process. What is the urgency needed in terms of them building a product? Entrepreneurs are concerned of paying their employees, getting sales, product development. So at what point do they need to engage with regulators? And that is their responsibility and accountability, but also for the regulators and FSRA here is particularly to say, okay, this is what it means to develop a product in cybersecurity. This is what it means to develop an insurtech product. This is what it means for them to collect data. This is what this is the technology that they're using. This is the artificial technology components that they're utilizing. So that when you guys are in conversation with each other, it's easier for the startups to be able to explain what could potentially be the friction point, and then feel supported and understood by the regulators, and then, of course, vice versa.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
On that note, I think that one of the things we wanted to bring up was how ambiguous regulations in the past have hurt Canadian fintechs. So not necessarily in Ontario and in the insurance space or FSRA's domain, but definitely there's been quite a few startups that we know of that have launched in Canada, launched in Ontario, were successful in getting customers, helping them, but because of unclear regulations around, in their cases, open banking, unclear regulations around what they can do, they've actually moved to the US to serve US customers. So there's a couple of examples with North One, which first moved from Quebec to Ontario to the US. Thrive Savings is another example. Or some of our startups have actually shut down because they just felt like they couldn't operate under that regulatory environment. And it was purely because of regulations, not because of customers, not because of funding, but because of that, because of just unclarity in that sense, in the open banking sense. So I think that there's really, the challenge would be just making sure that there is the clarity and guidance for these innovations to happen, as Lyle talked about.
Thanks. Yeah. Go ahead.
I think it was me. This whole panel is going to be me cutting you off, Marlena. I apologize. I was just going to add very, very in terms of that as well. It's sometimes it's the startups not understanding and not being able to navigate the regulatory landscape, but it's also other stakeholders that could potentially be partners or customers of these fintechs, not also wanting to dabble in the in any bad waters, if you will, in terms of regulations. And of course, usually we see incumbents fall into that bucket, or financial institutions, rather, credit unions, whomever, who are hesitant to shake up any regulations because they have a lot more to lose than perhaps a fintech with a smaller number of clients, et cetera. And so I think, we're talking about innovation and the landscape of fintechs, and Elvis mentioned some great examples of fintechs that have had to go to the States for whether customers or to navigate the regulatory landscape. But it's also very key that we ensure that the incumbents as well know how to navigate an innovation regulatory landscape as well, so that they can also leverage the fintechs that are currently building new and exciting products.
Right. And our framework definitely addresses both, and making sure that both parties have an equal playing field, as we not only support innovation, but also open the door to our test and learn environment, where we'll be able to test some of these innovations and pilots under a defined under defined parameters, and ensure that it's data driven results that we're obtaining.
Yeah.
So moving on, you guys, Fintech Cadence started in Quebec, where you have built excessive partnerships and various programs with AMF and a variety of other key stakeholders in this ecosystem. Can you maybe speak to some of your lessons learned from there, some of the key takeaways that we should be considering based on your experience with AMF and in Quebec?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think obviously having come and built our organization in Montreal, we have a lot of positive things to say about how the collaborative ecosystem has helped fintech in general. Now, I'm very much here looking at it from a Quebec landscape, so please keep that in mind as you're listening to the responses here. But I think one of the reasons why the landscape in Quebec, and particularly in Montreal, has been able to thrive is because the stakeholders have all been, from the very, very early days, in conversation with each other. And what I mean by that is venture capital and funders are talking to financial institutions to see, well, what are the challenges? What are the products you could potentially be using? Fintechs are talking to financial institutions. Fintechs are talking to venture capital or funders. And of course, and very key, AMF is part of all of these conversations, right? So I think one of the things we've seen work really well is the AMF, very similar to what FSRA is doing now, coming in and saying, this is why innovation is important. And we really want to encourage innovation. But at the top of the mind is, like you said, is consumer confidence. And so how are we able to do that properly? And then the other component that I think made AMF quite successful is they didn't have the answers to everything. They didn't necessarily know what is the technology being integrated in all of cryptocurrencies, for example. I know that was one of their strategies in the early days. There was humility around how they spoke to fintechs to be able to understand the technology and the products and what can actually be the impact on consumers. I think we're going to pretend, or we're going to go on the assumption that a lot of fintechs, when they're building their solutions, are doing so with the best of intentions. However, they might have blind spots that they're not aware of. And I think what we've seen work very, very well in Quebec is then the AMF has been able to be in conversations with these fintechs and say, these products are great. However, you're missing this blind spot or this blind spot. And the only reason they've been able to do that is because they were in conversation with the fintechs from the very early days. They were always transparent about their view on innovation is important, but we have to be careful with the speed of it. And I think fintechs were always comfortable going to them because they knew exactly who to go to, and they could see the presence of the regulator in all other conversations. And I think if, not to harp too much on this, but I think if the Montreal ecosystem has been successful, if you look at it as a success, then it has been so because of all of these conversations consistently happening, a lack of siloness, if you will, and an openness for all stakeholders to learn from each other and to understand that competition is good, but not to the point where we're hindering a city or a province in order to develop innovation solutions.
Yeah. So we've talked about this many times, and we wanted to make sure that as we engage proactively with fintech and insurtech hubs and innovation centers, that the collaboration is key. And as you said, having a seat at the table, right? I think there's learning on both sides, learning for us to better understand, again, what these innovators are trying to address and what problems they're trying to solve from a consumer perspective. And then also for others on the other side of the table to ensure that they have clear understanding and transparency around regulation and how can it potentially impact what they're building. Elvis, any thoughts from you?
No, I fully agree with Lyle, and I think it'll be exciting to have FSRA engage on the ground with in Ontario and really replicate some of the work that we've done in Montreal and Quebec. So obviously, Lyle is in Montreal, but I'm actually from the Toronto ecosystem, right? And I think it'd be exciting because I do think that in Ontario. We do have a very successful fintech space. We have some great fintechs that have gotten a lot of funding. But what I found, at least, is that it's not as open as the Montreal ecosystem. There's certain players that get a lot of support, but if you're a new fintech, it's very hard to break through. And part of that is because you there isn't right now as much of that connection. So it's good for us to establish that so that people know where they can go, have that open door policy with FISRA and potentially other regulators in the future as well. And I think that will just provide a lot more clarity for new entrepreneur to actually get started and know what they're doing and have a plan for a year or two down the line.
Great, thank you. And Leah, sorry, I cut you off right before I went to Elvis. So I just wanted to make sure that I give you an opportunity to raise anything else that you wanted to raise.
No, that's fine. Actually, maybe it was for the better because I was going to go on a whole spiel about how, we're very bullish about the fact that we really think fintech should be one of the top sectors in Canada. And actually, I was just on a call with a partner earlier today saying the exact same thing. And with that in mind, I think the more collaborative the ecosystem is across the board, and sorry if I'm sounding very evangelistic here, but across the board, when I say across the board, I truly mean between Quebec and Ontario, within Quebec, across Canada. Because when you look at it from what's happening globally, as much as I love the Canadian fintech ecosystem and think we've had some great successes, we're far behind on a lot of different components, on a lot of them, to be honest. And so in order for us to start being competitive globally, or more so competitive globally, in order for us to be ahead of the curve, we're already behind, and I don't want to make this an open banking conversation, but we're already behind in terms of a lot of things that are happening in the UK, Australia, the US, Singapore, East Asia, from an open banking, a regulatory perspective, let alone technology. That we're seeing. So I think the best way and the best lessons that we can take with what's happening in Montreal, which is that collaboration, implementing that and leveraging the strengths that Ontario has, and in doing so with a supportive regulatory landscape, for lack of a better word, I think will only help us be more competitive globally and really addressing consumer needs for Canadians by Canadians, which is ultimately what we want, especially from a regulatory perspective, is the best products for Canadians in the safest way.
Thank you. I think excellent point. So as we have about 8 minutes left, and I just wanted to make sure that we touch on this last question. As we now move to our third year of the pandemic, a lot of consumer behaviors have fundamentally changed and were forced to change due to COVID. Unlike the urgent switch from people-based business doing online digital platforms that happened in March 2020, what are some of the new trends and challenges that you're seeing that these fintechs and insurtechs are trying to address, and where are they trying to add value or drive value for consumers?
Perfect. Elvis, do you want to start? And I'll jump on right after you.
Yeah, I can go first. So my role at Fintech Cadence is the Director of Financial Health. So I'm really thinking of which startups are improving the financial lives of financially vulnerable Canadians. And I think one of the interesting things about fintech is looking at how Canada is changing, figuring out which markets are currently underserved, and addressing those issues. So in this space, a lot of Canadians are becoming freelancers, gig workers, self-employed. It's just rarer now to be full-time employed in a job for the past 20 years. So that obviously affects pensions, that affects insurance that you have access to. So at least what I've been interested in, and I've been seeing a lot more startups that are focused on niche, what we traditionally would say are niche markets, but self-employed freelancers that are growing, right? And figuring out how do we provide insurance for the self-employed. For example, the nonprofit industry, a lot of nonprofit workers are actually contract workers. So they don't have access to retirement savings, pensions. So how do you provide portable benefits, portable plans for some of these workers so that we support our workforce, right? So that's just one segment, but we also have other fintechs thinking of newcomers, thinking of racialized Canadians, thinking of, we had one startup that was focused fully on temporary foreign workers here in Ontario and Canada, where we have every year we have workers come from Mexico and different places in Latin America, and they're actually here year after year for the summer. And there's financial services that they need that they're being underserved by the current ecosystem. So, what are these segments, and trying to address some of these concerns is what I'm excited about in the ecosystem.
Yeah,
Leah,
and then just to
over
add,
to you.
perfect. So just to add a bit of also perspective there. So that's, I think Elvis touched wonderfully on some of the consumer needs as well. Maybe I'll just add two things as we're starting to see as well. A lot of consumers are becoming more and more digitally savvy, are expecting a lot more from their financial, not only from their financial services, but all the experiences and touch points that they have with any kind of financial service as well. So we're starting to see that. We're starting to see a bit more awareness in terms of what's happening globally as well. So Canadians are able to compare and contrast the services. And then, of course, we've had these stories come up, with GameStop and investments and all of these components as well happen throughout COVID. So I think consumers are also wondering, what does investment look like for them when something drastically happens, like a pandemic? How prepared am I? How much insurance do I have? And so we're seeing a lot more insurtech, fintechs, and a lot more solutions come and address those. But I will say now, unfortunately, 3 years into this nightmare, if you will, we're also seeing some of the fintechs move away from consumer-based solutions. Other than the ones that Elvis had already addressed, and we're starting to see them move to more smaller businesses, entrepreneurs, and more B2B solutions as well. So we're starting to see that shift, and that's really dependent on two things. One, more people from industry building and providing those solutions, but also it's quite challenging to build a very successful fintech startup directly to consumers. And so we're starting to see some of the entrepreneurs who've been in the space for a while pivot a little bit more to businesses and understanding what the requirements are there. Because there's usually, and I say this with a hesitation, but usually you'll see more success rates with businesses, specifically because of the regulatory landscape and because of the landscape in general here in Canada.
Right. And maybe if I could maybe add to it, would you feel that it's also consumer education is such a big piece, an important piece in all of this, right? Because as things are changing so quickly, are we ensuring that there's enough consumer education around these new products or businesses or new services, right? The trust piece is such an important piece, especially when it comes to finances.
Yeah, and you're hitting something true
Exactly.
to my Elvis, go ahead. Please go ahead.
No, exactly. We think it's like so important for Canadians to be digitally literate, to understand now when you can do so much on your phone with these apps, to really understand what they're getting into. Actually, interestingly enough, earlier this week, we were in a conversation with the Financial Consumer Agency of Canada, and we're talking about this, how there needs to be a role for someone in Canada to really help Canadians understand fintechs and products and services in general, and understand whether it's good or bad for them, and be able to actually assess that. And there needs to be some unbiased source that can help Canadians navigate this landscape for sure.
Thank you. So as we wrap up, Leal and Elvis, I wanted to thank you for joining me over this half an hour for one of the many more discussions that I believe we will have and will need to have around how do we support innovation and how do we help enable innovation within our financial services sector. And if any call to action that individuals on the other side could take away from this, our office is open for collaboration and discussion. We have our innovation office website that is live. We have contact information on the website. We also have FAQs on our test and learn environment, as well as a quick summary of the framework if you haven't read the detailed document. So I invite you to have a look, and I also invite you to get in touch with us on your exciting opportunities. Thank you very much again. And Glenn, over to you.
Thanks, Marlena, and thanks, folks from FinTech Cadence. That was a great session and really informative. I just wanted to remind folks again who took the time to provide some questions through the question and answer box. We endeavor to respond to all of those questions. and get back to you when we start posting the materials on the FSRA website. So rest assured, we've been capturing everything, and the teams will be going back and providing responses. And I know there was one question that I can quickly answer. It was, how do you spell FinTech Cadence? And the cadence part is CADENCE. So anyone who wants to check out the FinTech Cadence website, please feel free to do so. So again, thank you, Marlena and team, for a great session.